What is good? I'm Matt Jumper, and you are about to get your hands dirty with 3D and Framer. I'm going to walk you through the basics of the new 3D properties, and then I'm going to show you how to make this animation, and as always, without any code. But before we start, I wanted to share my 2 cents on 3D, because during the spring event, Framer announced 3D transforms, and the reactions were pretty mixed. And honestly, I get it. I get both sides. On one hand, 3D transforms with CSS are technically nothing new, right? Like the CSS functionality has been around for a while. And when a lot of people think about 3D and web design, they think of unnecessary and like over the top, or even too simple but kind of corny 3D animations like a card flip. Things that just like don't need to be in 3D, but people figured out how to do it and it ends up in 3D. This also doesn't help because, a lot of no-code developers are kind of known for going a bit ham with the animations as it is, and that's just in 2 dimensions. So adding a 3rd dimension to this might bring some more chaos. But on the other hand, Framer is the first no-code development tool to actually have these elements and all their bounding boxes being rendered in the 3D space in the canvas. So it actually gives you the ability to visually edit in 3D like never before. That's super exciting to me because up until now, I'm like familiar with 3D and CSS, but without being able to actually like edit the canvas and like get an actual visual representation of what you're doing, it's kind of complicated and not really worth the exploration because like all these crazy things you can think of, it's hard to make those happen with just looking at values and numbers and properties and not seeing how it comes to life. Now let's get into the walkthrough. All right, so jumping into Framer, I have just a frame here with a solid fill, and inside this frame I have text. I don't have anything applied to these things yet as far as 3D goes, but we can start that by going to transforms and we get a bunch of options here. And we can start with the most important one, which is rotate. So if we click rotate, we get 2D as the default, which I can just rotate it in 2 dimensions as we're kind of used to. If I click on 3D, I get now the option to rotate it along the x-axis, which is basically the horizontal axis. I can rotate it along the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. And then I can rotate it along the z-axis, which is, think of it as like the depth axis, right? If x is wide, y is tall, z is kind of forward and back. Now we have full control over this element in 3D space. And what's awesome is that this bounding box is actually wrapped around this frame here, and I can click and drag this however I want. This brings me to my next kind of property here. So you'll see I'm dragging this and the element inside isn't following, right? Because it's just text inside the frame. So this is kind of how we expect things to work. What's cool now is under transforms, we can do scale, and I can just increase this whole thing by whatever number, as well as decrease it like 0.5, and it just scales everything proportionally. This is actually not a new kind of property in Framer. We had this before underneath the effects. So we could do this like as a transition or an animation. But now we can actually do it to any element on the canvas, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to set this back to 1. And now we can hop over to skew. So this is a pretty common 3D element or property. And basically it's just going to skew it along the x-axis or the y-axis. We're not going to use this in the demo today, but it's a pretty useful 3D property. I'm just going to remove it. And then we have depth, which sometimes gets confusing with scale, because scale, I can click down and up and everything just kind of gets bigger. With depth, and if I click on this now, not much is going to happen, right? With depth, we're actually manipulating the position of this element within the context of the 3D space that we've set. So bear with me. The frame here has these 3D properties. So this is where it is in space. The depth here isn't inside of this space. It's manipulating like this layer. So nothing's actually happening. If I go to the 3D layer here and add a transform and do depth, this is what will work to actually use depth. But when I first drag it, it's not going to work. It doesn't do anything, which brings me to the next one, and I'll come back to depth. But the reason why, if you're manipulating anything inside of like nesting layers, you want to make sure that preserve 3D is set to yes. So set to no, it just nothing inside has any 3D value. When you go to yes, it just inherits or allows anything to pass through. So 3D now, I set that depth. So this actually is working. And this is what I mean by it's moving it along the z-axis and not just like making it bigger or smaller. If we were looking at this straight on, the scale and the depth properties would kind of be the same thing, like visually speaking. It gets closer to you and further away when it's straight on, but you'll see the difference here when we actually have it in the 3D space. Those are those first elements. And then what we have left is perspective, which if you think of perspective as kind of like how far or close away you are to the center or the zero of like the z-axis. Basically, the easy way to think about this is the smaller the perspective, the closer you are and the more kind of dramatic the animations are going to be, versus further away, it's going to be like you're more distant from it, so it's less dramatic. And when we do the demo, you'll see a bit more of what I mean. When you have just kind of like two elements like this, you don't necessarily get that effect, but I'll come back to like an actual use case of this. And then origin. So if I have this to 50-50 as the default, basically the origin of the anchor point of where these elements are being rotated in 3D space. The X is 50%, Y is 50%, meaning it's anchored to the middle, right? So if I'm rotating this, it's anchored from the middle. If I change this to 0, 0, now it's anchored from the top left. So you'll see the top left is staying where it is, and it's like has like a doorway almost now, right? So you can manipulate these numbers to play with like where it's being changed from, just to give it different effects. And then backface is basically, you just have two options, visibility and hidden. You'll notice that when we change the Y rotation and it kind of swings forward and back, when you have backface hidden and we get to like the back side of the frame or the layer, it actually disappears because we have it hidden. This is helpful when you can basically like do that card flip I was talking about, where like you could set it so the back face is hidden and then you can add another layer on top of it, and then you're just kind of hiding and showing the layer based off of if it's behind it or not. So that's a walkthrough of all these different properties. If you haven't fully grasped them yet, don't worry. I'm going to cover a bunch of them again as we actually get into making this 3D animation. So let's get started there. All right, now for the fun part, let's start the animation. I'm going to tap F and just draw anywhere, and I'm going to make a new component. So right click, create component, and this will be, we just call it 3D. The width and the height here, I want to match the app that we have, and the standard size, just 390 by 844. And then the fill, I can remove this. The overflow I'll set to visible, and we can drop in the app image, app.png. The link is in the description below, by the way, to all these assets. And we can set the width to 100% because it's actually going to be the same size as the container we just made. And then we'll just center it. I'm going to set the visibility to no because we're going to just make this visible at the last stage of the animation. And then I'm going to tap F again, and I'm going to make a container. I'm going to call it 3D container. And this is going to house all of the 3D cards inside of it. So the first thing is I'll make the size the same as the card, so 300 by 460. And I'll center it in this canvas again. I'll remove the fill. And what I want to do here, it's the container. So basically this is going to have the 3D rotation on it. And then the elements inside are going to be abiding by that 3D space that it's set. And then that's how we kind of get the cool cards like following each other instead of having them like kind of randomized. Here under effects, under transforms, we can go to rotate. We'll go to 3D, and we can set the rotations to 25 minus 45 and 8. And I don't have any fill here, but you'll see by the bounding box that we have a bit of rotation here. And the other thing I want to add here is perspective. So 1000 is good. It doesn't change much here, but I'll come back to this once we have all the elements inside. You can see how much perspective actually changes things. That's deep. Okay, so we have our 3D container. So now if we make the cards inside, I'll tap F and just draw a frame inside here. And the width and height, we can make this 100% to fill up that space, and then we'll just center it. And you'll see automatically it's abiding by that same 3D rotations. And then we'll call this card 1. And what we can do is we can just grab the card 1 image, copy it, open up the fill here, and go to image and paste this in. So you'll see that this is in 3D space, like it has that rotation to it, and I can move it around. but it's still not like, it doesn't look 3D because there's no thickness to it, right? Like there's no depth to that card. It's still like a 2D layer, and that's fine for a lot of cases. But what we can do is we can actually make this look like a 3D card, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's start by taking this card one layer and duplicating it, and I'm going to put this inside here. So this still has the image fill. I'm going to remove it from here, and again, this is just going to like house the layers inside. So this is just a container again. This is now the front. We'll call this front. We don't have to change anything here. If I duplicate this, I'm going to call this the back. And what I want to do is move this down in this 3D space, however much thickness we want this card. So the first step, let's say we want this card to be 12 pixels thick, and it's good to pick a number that can be divided by 2. So let's go with 12. And one thing to understand with 3D space is like if the sides that we're making are 12 pixels tall, for it to like start from the center of that z-axis, it's actually going to go 6 pixels each side. So the depth that we need to adjust on the back and the front is actually like +6 in the front and then -6 in the back. It kind of, well, it makes it a line, but it's also like the math is kind of the easiest there. Otherwise it gets a bit muddy. So what we can do is on this back here, we can add a depth, and again, move it along that z-axis, -6. And you'll see that nothing happened here. So we can go to card 1, and we can go to transforms, and we'll do preserve 3D. We'll do yes, and make sure it's on the 3D container as well. We'll do preserve 3D, and it's yes. So now you'll see that there's a card there that's 6 pixels deep. And on the front one, we can do the same thing, but move it up or forward 6 pixels. So now this is 12 pixels of distance in the z-axis between each other. So if I were to take this 3D container now and move this around, you can kind of see that distance is 12 pixels. So position-wise, this looks good. The back is, instead of having the image kind of reflected, what we can do is replace this image with the back card that we have. So I can just copy this and fill it. And you'll see that if I move this 3D container, if I change this axis here, you'll see that the back is reversed. So what we can do is offset this by going to the back layer, and the 3D rotation, we can set the Y to 180. So now it's just offsetting that 180 of the 3D container. That looks good. But now obviously we need all of these sides to be done. What we can do is start with the front again, because we have that image fill, which I still want to use. I'm going to duplicate this. And then I'm going to change the width to the 12 pixels. The height, we'll keep it at 100%. And then the depth we'll actually remove. And then 3D, we're going to change the, I think it's the Y to 90 degrees. And you'll see we get a bit of a perspective there. So now if I change this anchor to the right, we actually have an edge here. So if I remove this Y-axis, that actually connects. So we're actually making a solid card here. I'm going to show you with the image in a second. The fill, I have the image and we'll fix it. Typically, you could actually just fill this with like a color here if you wanted to, and like that easily makes an edge. But since we have this nice image, using this image, I'm actually going to change the position of the anchor point to the, what is on the right side. So we'll do right. I'll name this layer right so we're organized. And then on the rotation, I'm going to change both these to 180. And then now we have a reflection of that front image. Now we can hit styles and we can add a brightness. So what we want to do in the 3D space, basically like there's always light, right? So you want to add typically a highlight and a shadow to each of the sides. So we can decide the right and left to be highlights and the top and the bottom to be shadows. And to mimic that, we can basically use a brightness filter to make the image or the side brighter or darker. So the brightness on the side, we'll call it a highlight. So it'll be higher than 100%, and we'll just do 25. So we'll do 125% for the highlight, and then on the shadow side, we'll do 75%. So that looks good. We can duplicate this right one now. we'll call it left, and basically just do the same thing but for the other side. So the width and the height are good. The brightness is good. This rotation is good, and we just need to change the anchor point to the left. And if we rotate this, let's see what happens. That looks good for the placement, but we can just click on this and we can change the image anchor point to the left. And that looks good. We'll duplicate this and do the same thing now for the bottom. And it's going to be a bit different. So the width here is going to be 100% now. And the height will change to 12. And then I think we just got to flip these. So the X is going to be 90 and then this will be 180. And then we'll align it to the bottom to the center. Yeah, so that looks good for the alignment. And then I just got to change the position as well of the image. So this will be bottom center. And then we'll duplicate this again, do this top, just anchor point to the top, and then image focal point is, or sorry, the image anchor point is the top center. And I'll just take this and preview it again. What that looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. And then one last quick thing here, the top and the bottom, we said these are going to be the shadows, and the left and the right were going to be the highlights. So we just got to take the brightness on these two frames and drop it down to 75%. Now for the other two. I take this card 1 and duplicate it. We'll call it card 2. And what's nice about this is that I can actually just select all of these layers here and click on the image, and it's not going to override the position. We can just change the image itself. So I can just copy this, paste it, and it's totally replaced. Do it again, duplicate it, card 3, select all these layers and replace it again. So you'll notice that all of these cards are now basically in the same position, but that's why we set the 3D container to have these properties, so we can actually take the cards here and set the depth of each one individually. So I'm going to select all 3 and just add depth to it, and then we'll change each one. So the first one, say 800, you'll see it's way up here now. Again, which is nice, where it's actually moving it along the Z-axis and not just making it bigger, making it smaller. So you'll see like this alone, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do, like sharing the same 3D space. So the card 2 now, we can make this 400. And then card 3, we can actually make this like minus 100 just to get more space there. And then while we're in this view as well, I'll show you the perspective we set to 1000. I think this looks good, but all these values you can totally play with on your end. If I decrease this, you'll see it's like we're getting closer and like way more dramatic results versus like if I reduce the perspective, we're getting further away from the action and it's a lot less. So I'm gonna leave it at 1000, but feel free to play with whatever you want. Okay, so we have our 3D cards. If I preview this, there's no animation, but we can just see that it's looking good in the 3D space. The next step here is to add a variant. And what we can do is make this state basically those all the cards just stacked on top of each other, basically in 2D, like just looking straight at it. So we can remove all of the 3D aspects to it. So we'll just click on the 3D container, set all these to 0. And then inside of here, we can take all these cards and we'll set the depth to 0 for now. But you'll see that this card 3 is on top, this one. But we actually want it at the back. And traditionally, you're probably thinking about Z-index, but we're in 3D space. We're still using the Z-axis, but we're not using Z-index. Z-index is really for 2 dimensions. This is actually, we can use the depth to actually move it along the Z-axis and prioritize it that way. So the depth of this one can remain at 0, but then this next one we can set to 1, and you'll see it's going to come above it. And the other one, we can set it to 2. We can take this 3D container, and this perspective isn't really going to do anything, but we can just remove it just so we have less things to worry about in each of these frames. And then the third variant, we can duplicate this variant too. And I'm going to select the app and actually set the visibility to yes. And you'll notice that these cards are a bit too big for the app. So what we can do is go to the 3D container and we'll add a transform and change the scale to 0.75. And then I'm gonna just use shift and the arrow to, whoop, I'm still in the scale here. Click off first and then click back in it, and you can shift arrow down. Make sure it's centered, yeah. And I'm gonna take card 3 and shift arrow it out. And then once it's aligned, I'm gonna shift arrow twice to the right, and then take card 2, move it to the left. And then we'll take this variant 3 and set the overflow to hidden. That way it actually cuts off the images. And you'll notice, if you look closely, there's actually still this 3D stuff going on. So what we can do is select all of these layers here and just unselect the main cards and unselect the fronts. And we're just gonna hide them. And we can select the fronts and we can add a radius to them. We'll make this 16. I couldn't do this in the 3D space because that'd be super difficult. Basically, like, we made a stack of, or a cube essentially of hard edges. If you had rounded edges, it's not that easy. But this is a nice way to handle it. It would be a nice transition. But this looks good. We might still run into some issues once we preview this, but as far as the general construction goes, these are 3 good states. So what we can do now is actually make these connections. So this is going to be a single animation that basically just starts from variant 1 and goes all the way to variant 3. So we'll start by taking the lightning bolt here and create interaction, going to variant 2. And this is going to be on top. It's going to be on appear. We're going to give it a delay of 0.1. And basically it's instantly going to go into variant 2. Let's select variant 2. Do the same thing to variant 3. We'll do 0.1. And then variant 3 will remove this that was automatically set from the first variant. So now it's going to end on variant 3. It's not going to change. So let's preview this, see what we get. Okay, so very fast. Also, this position and size is off, right? So let's take a look at that first. We have the 3 cards here, and what we still have is the depth at 2, 1, and 0. So what we can do is we can just set all of these to 1. And I can just preview this one so we don't get the animation, see if that fixes it. So that looks better. And then the speed of all these things. So there's 2 key things to understand. One is, and this is like not a 3D specific thing, but the way that these transitions work in Framer, I have this as appear and delay 0.1, it's going to go to the next one, and then 0.1 is going to go to this one. Playing with these values, it's hard to really understand what the results are going to be until you preview it. But a big factor here is actually going to be the transitions themselves. So typically, like, Spring is what I would use for most like 2D transitions or animations. For 3D, I really like Ease because you get more control over it. I'm going to paste in these values here that I know work well. And the time here, I'm actually going to extend this to 1 second and just make sure all of these transitions just have enough time to make an elegant animation. So that one at 1 second is fine. And then this one, it'll inherit that Bezier, which is good. But then the time, I actually want to increase this to like 4 seconds, which isn't 4 seconds between this one and this one. I'm pretty sure it's actually 4 seconds from this to this. It's kind of confusing to like get a grasp on that, to be honest, but these are just the numbers I played with and these make sense. So this time is going to be 4 seconds and this delay is actually going to be 3.5 seconds. And let's preview this and see what we get. Okay, so that is nice. And that didn't take much. Basically take this another step further with the animation and add an appear effect to this whole thing. And that way we're adding, instead of like changing this 3D container's 3D space, we're basically nesting 3D spaces, which sounds confusing, but basically you can just do like add more cool layers to it. And you can also add, if you wanted to do appear animations for 3D and like rotating the cards individually, you could also do that. I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself. But the variant 1, we can add an effect and we'll do appear. And this will be on appear is fine. The enter effect, we're just going to manually put this in. So the opacity 0, so I want this to fade in. For the scale, we'll do 0.5. I will add some 3D rotations here. We'll do 24, 32, 16. I mean, that's just my 8 pixel grid seeing what works or what looks good. Then the offset, we'll do 400, 400. This is basically like pushing it to the right and to the bottom. And then transition, we'll do another ease, and we'll use, those numbers are fine here. And then the time, we'll do 2 seconds. So let's see this. I did notice that the app just kind of like appears. So what I want to do is go to variant 2, and I'm going to set the visibility to yes and the opacity to 0, and see if this gives us that fade that we need. That's nice. Okay. So we can go to the home page, and we have our 3D layer here. We can actually set the width and height to fit. If this feels big, I'm not doing like a full responsive thing in this video, but we can actually add a scale and bring this down to 0.75, which is a very nice touch. So we pre this on the gray background. Cosmo approves. That's good, isn't it? You like that? You like 3D? Yeah. And then on this canvas here, I just made this stack of text here with appear animations on the text blocks that basically start at 4 seconds and are offset by 0.2. So if I add this, that text isn't going to appear until the animation's done, and it kind of comes in step by step. I think this is it. It is it. We did it. Remember to, when you use 3D, to be responsible and not do corny shit and not get too carried away. I'm trying to like strike the balance. If there's more Framer stuff that you want to see, leave a comment below. Follow me on X, follow me on YouTube. There will be more Framers videos coming out soon. Thanks for watching. See y'all later.